Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening as it applies to you. And welcome to our webinar. Today's webinar is titled Building a Net Zero Oil and Gas Company. And my name is Arie van Berkel. I'm a Senior Vice President and Group Director here at Lux Research, and I'll be moderating today's session. So I'm very happy to see we have a large crowd today, and thankfully not just people from oil and gas companies. And that's good because the changes in the oil and gas industry are going to affect the entire value chain. They're going to affect chemicals because it affects the supply of feedstock. They're going to affect utilities, of course, because it's going to oil and gas companies maybe heading in your direction as a utility. And it's going to affect many other value chains around the globe. So again, welcome, happy to see you all here. And we'll dive right in with my colleague who's presenting today, Chris Robinson, who's a Senior Director, and he leads all of our energy research here at Lux. So Chris, take us through the webinar. Before I start, I shouldn't forget one thing. Should you have questions, and we do hope you do have questions, feel free to type them in the questions box on your screen. And we'll try and answer as many questions as we can after the presentation. If we don't answer your question, or if you have a question afterwards, or if you would like to pose the question in a less public way, just send them to questions@luxresearchinc.com and we'll respond after the webinar. Right, Chris, floor is yours.
Thank you, Arie, and hello everyone and welcome. So today we'll talk about what does a net zero oil and gas company look like? And I think it's a good conversation to have today because ultimately I think the industry is a bit of a crossroads where on one hand, you've made yourself both indispensable to modern life, yet are still the primary contributor to rising emissions that are really catalyzing the energy transition away from oil and gas. And what's even more prescient is the pace of this change is accelerating. Announcements that are would have been major developments a few years ago today are commonplace just today. Things like, new lithium-ion battery gigafactories, new multi-billion-dollar valuations for startups in the climate tech space, or announcements of massive gigafactory, or I should say, gigawatt-scale electrolyzer farms. So clearly, it's worth having a vision of what an oil and gas company looks like in a net zero future. So I'll start today by talking a little bit about what are the drivers behind the urgency to create this vision. Then I'll talk about specific opportunities for oil and gas companies within the context of Lux's net zero strategy framework. And finally, offer some guidance for how to go about taking action on these strategies. So starting with the urgency for change, which I think there really is urgency that few would disagree with. One major big part of this is that public opinions continue to shift, being more supportive of a phase out of fossil fuels and embracing of carbon neutrality goals. Most of the world feels this way today, and if we look closer at demographics, we see younger generations showing the most support for those types of measures. So in the future, we would expect continued strong support and increasing support for those carbon neutrality goals. But this is already having an impact in oil and gas companies today, in a few different ways. One, Shell was held liable in a courtroom for its actions over its role in climate change. So it was ordered by the Dutch court to reduce emissions 45% by 2030 compared to 2019 levels. And we're seeing similar moves happen not just in courtrooms, but in boardrooms. ExxonMobil, most notably a couple of years ago, had Engine Number One, an activist investor, secure several board seats successfully at the organization and have been pushing for change within the organization, having a direct impact on some of its climate proposals and climate plans. Along with public support, we're also seeing a dramatic improvement in technology that are alternatives to fossil fuels. For example, solar and wind today remain the cheapest ways to produce electricity if you look purely at a levelized cost of electricity basis, while the raw materials supply chains to make those components continue to improve. In the late 2000s, of course, we saw a hiccup with polysilicon prices that was eventually sorted out, of course. And I think today we're in a similar space with batteries, where we do see kind of a hiccup as the pace of change of adoption and production of batteries increases dramatically. But we have seen those indicators kind of start to smooth out and suggest long-term the supply of critical materials is needed to improve, but is not necessarily a critical limiting factor. I think my favorite part of technology improvement, maybe as a mechanical engineer, I'm biased, is actually looking at the heat pump. So 30 years ago, anyone in the HVAC space would have told you putting a heat pump in a very cold environment won't sufficiently heat a house in those very cold weathers where efficiency and its ability to produce heat declines. However, today we also see Maine in the United States as one of the leading states in per capita adoption of heat pump sales, as really a combination of efficiency improvements in the home and heat pump efficiency and performance improvements have improved. So if we look at the DOE's residential cold climate heat pump challenge, a few manufacturers have already reached that 5 Fahrenheit target with a pathway toward negative 15 Fahrenheit operations as well. So we have public support, we have technology improvements and alternatives to fossil fuels. And I think the biggest impact this has on oil and gas organizations is ultimately the policy that this environment creates. Policymakers are very emboldened when they have both that public support as well as alternatives from a technology perspective to fossil fuels. And the nature of these policies is changing, with some of the strongest kind of climate-related policies emerging in just the last couple of years. We're seeing policy support emerge from not just looking at foundational technology discovery, but into applied innovation, where we're actually seeing policies like the Inflation Reduction Act here in the US really focus on deploying these technologies, not finding scientific breakthroughs. And we are only just starting to see the geopolitics of the energy transition emerge. We've seen policies that look at restricting imports and exports of certain materials, and others that define market rules to just ensure that supply chains are developed domestically. And no countries are over-reliant upon foreign entities for the supply chain of materials that would be needed within the energy transition. So this has really created that urgency, and it's worth now looking at a roadmap for what net zero might look like for an oil and gas organization. So here I've shown the IEA's net zero 2050 scenario. I think we can certainly debate the timelines and exact market shares of each carrier. Ultimately, I think this is probably an optimistic view of the energy transition, but it provides roughly a good roadmap for what net zero looks like. So if we look at 2050, we see an interesting few things. One is large amounts of electricity growth. Many processes will decarbonize by electrifying and powering by renewables. And we see less overall energy consumption because electrification of many processes is more efficient than burning hydrocarbons. But importantly, we do still see a smaller role for hydrocarbons, but a smaller non-zero role. So we do expect to have both gaseous and liquid hydrocarbons in the future. So now we can transition to talking about opportunities for oil and gas companies and what they might look like in this net zero future. And to do that, I'll start with our net zero strategy framework for oil and gas companies. These 5 strategies are strategies oil and gas companies can deploy that can fit within that vision of a net zero future in 2050. You have the status quo strategy, which focuses on existing operations, essentially continuing to extract liquid and gaseous hydrocarbons from the earth. The new fuel strategy, where you embrace the fact that liquid fuels for transportation, or I should say, providing fuels for transportation is your main business, and you become carrier agnostic, focusing not just on oil and gas, but other energy carriers. We have the chemical strategy, where you lean into the fact that, of course, you supply primarily materials as a feedstock into the chemical space, and you move downstream, acquiring or competing directly with those organizations that make primary, secondary, or specialty chemicals. We have the sequestration strategy, where a business invests in carbon capture, transportation, and sequestration or utilization technologies, not just for their internal consumption, but also to build a business to supply these services to others. And finally, the utility strategy, where we embrace electricity growth as an energy carrier and develop a strategy to capture that. Now, before I jump in, it's worth noting these strategies are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Especially larger oil and gas firms will have to look at a number of these strategies simultaneously. And when we work with customers specifically to understand where they might fit along the spectrum, we've actually plotted within, scored each of our clients within these strategies in kind of a spider chart format to show that many strategies are possible at once. So we'll dig in a little bit deeper, highlighting the pros and cons of each of these strategies, as well as examples of oil and gas companies using these strategies. And we'll start with the status quo strategy. Again, this is doubling down on oil and gas, aiming to change probably as little as much as possible within its existing operations. Now, the upsides to this strategy are probably unsurprising, that today there is a very large market for these things, even if we draw a line from here to 2050 and see that market share is in constant decline. But more importantly is the societal backlash. We've already noted some of the challenges that oil and gas companies have had in face of public pressure. And within this strategy, that pressure will continue to mount. Now, one organization that probably best exemplifies this strategy would be Saudi Aramco. Now, they recently invested just shy of $14 billion to acquire a stake in a couple of petrochemicals companies based out of China. Now, it's tempting to think of this as a chemical strategy. I'm looking to get more into the chemical space. But if we dig a little bit deeper, I think their motivations are really about the status quo strategy. These deals come with long-term supply agreements for crude, where Aramco will be supplying crude to these chemicals production facilities, which it is somewhat advantageous because their assets are better suited for a crude to chemicals pathway than some other crude assets. And this is more so about finding that last source of demand for crude. As demand for liquid fuels for transportation declines, as the share of electric vehicles continues to grow. And this is one of those pathways that will prolong its ability to continue to utilize its upstream oil and gas assets. So this is less so about getting into chemicals, more about finding demand for crude in the future. Now, if we look toward the next strategy, the new fuel strategy, we know that the oil and gas industry likes to think of themselves as very diversified, but the reality is its core product is liquid fuels used in transportation. So in this strategy, you focus on that end market and just become carrier agnostic, because really at the end of the day, mobility has the largest demand for energy, and you have experience in the mobility sector already. Now, of course, the challenge here is that there's no single fuel that will be used to decarbonize the transport sector. We'll likely see things like electrification rapidly penetrate the light duty and medium duty vehicle space for road transport. We'll need biofuels for aviation and shipping, and maybe we'll see that transition to hydrogen as well over time, with maybe different carriers like ammonia being considered in shipping. So ultimately, you need to master many different processes and quote unquote fuels in this future, some of which are likely less profitable than others. Now, we've seen a lot of oil and gas companies active in this space, investing in fast charging networks or converting refineries to biofuels. But one of the challenging areas has remained hydrogen and its role in transportation. Now, over time, hydrogen has been thought of the fuel of the future for transportation in probably 5 or 6 different occasions. But I think this project between BP, TotalEnergies, and Daimler really focuses on an application where there might actually be some demand. Whereas we've seen initial focuses on light-duty vehicles be really displaced by electrification, looking at long-distance, heavy-duty transportation, electrification will struggle in that particular application. Hydrogen still has the potential to be the fuel of choice. Now, they're deploying stations in a very targeted manner, which is important as hydrogen fueling stations are very expensive to own and operate, and today are more so loss makers. And also importantly, they're involving Daimler, a production of heavy-duty trucking vehicles with a focus on building fuel cell trucks as well. If we continue looking at the chemical strategy, this one involves moving downstream of even your refinery, not just supplying products like naphtha to the plastic space, but actually acquiring some of those primary, secondary, or specialty chemicals manufacturers. Now, in this strategy, it's worth noting the oil and gas industry is much richer than the chemical space. So you can muscle out through acquisition or just entering a new space compared to those new entrants with relative ease. But the other side of that coin, of course, is that you're entering a smaller market. Now, it is a higher margin market, but convincing shareholders or stakeholders that pursuing a smaller market will face an uphill battle, particularly one that is also plagued with regulations on things like single-use plastic bans or other types of chemicals that are used in the world today. So you're moving into a smaller market with more regulatory hurdles. Now, we've seen oil and gas companies active in this space, and one area we have seen them active in is advanced plastics recycling. So to use Total Energies as an example, once again, they're working with a company called Plastic Energy. Now, Plastic Energy specializes in converting some of those non-recycled plastics into a recycled feedstock that they call tack oil, which can then be sent to a cracker to make a variety of different plastics products. In this case, Total Energies is focused on converting them into food-grade polymers. So at this facility they announced in Spain, along with other facilities, they'll have about 81,000 tons per year of plastics pyrolysis capacity. So Total Energies can soon join other organizations like SABIC, for example, in actually offering a mass balance certified plastics to many of their customers. And moving to the sequestration strategy, once again, this is where an oil and gas company focuses on turning itself into a carbon removal company, focused on the entire value chain of capturing, moving, and ultimately either using or sequestering that CO2. Now, the advantages here are you're leveraging some existing expertise, where a lot of the equipment used at a carbon capture facility might mirror equipment you're already familiar with. However, the biggest challenge will again be societal backlash. Similar to the status quo strategy, this will be viewed as extending the use of fossil fuel assets. Even with the recent acquisition of carbon engineering by Oxy, some comments were made that this can extend the life of the oil and gas industry by 70 to 80 years. And those types of comments really reinforce the public view that this is something, a technology that is viewed as extending the life of the oil and gas industry, even if we can look at analyses like the IEA's net zero 2050 scenario and see that carbon negative has to be part of our solution set if we are actually to achieve carbon negative goals by 2050. So there are many organizations that have started building these types of businesses already, focusing on deploying carbon capture projects and deploying those on site for customers. But one thing I think is interesting is the recent expansion by Svante to not just focus on point source carbon capture, which is I think what they're most well known for, but also working with United Airlines and their Sustainable Flight Fund to move into direct air capture. Now, aviation is one of the, if we just look at the size of the addressable market, potentially largest potential markets for using CO2, because we believe aviation will still need liquid fuels for transportation in the future. If we use synthetic fuels where that you're still going to be emitting carbon, so your source of carbon needs to come from the atmosphere, something like direct air capture. So for liquid fuels to be used in aviation in a net zero world, it will need to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So it's working with Svante to do that. So Svante is kind of the supplier of CCUS in this case. And our final strategy is the utility strategy, really embracing electrification and viewing electron as the new oil, and that the demand for electricity will continue to grow in the future, and you're entering a very large growing market. Now, the drawback is essentially the same as the chemical space, where one, you're entering a smaller market, so you need to convince shareholders that this is the right move, even if this market looks like it's going to grow in the future. And two, you are entering a space with regulatory barriers, right? They're very different than the chemical space in that it's not product bans, and it's just overall operating in an environment with a lot of kind of red tape, so to speak. So if we look at companies exemplifying this strategy, again, I think we can see a lot of different activities in this space. But one I think that's an opportunity for a lot of oil and gas companies is looking at long duration energy storage. In this strategy, it's really important to recognize we're not just focused on being a retailer of electricity and selling electricity. It also can mean supplying components to enable electrification. And this is where oil and gas companies can really leverage their R&D backgrounds and skill sets in the physical world to deploy and develop solutions. So one example of this would be Equinor, who led an investment into Ellistor, which develops hydrogen-blooming flow batteries. And flow batteries are interesting because they are typically more promising at longer durations, which here means really anything more than 4 hours, where lithium-ion batteries aren't necessarily always the best fit. And flow batteries are beneficial because they can typically cycle for tens of thousands of cycles, and you scale energy and power independently, where if you want more energy, you build bigger tanks. If you want more power, you build bigger stacks. So we've talked about a lot of these strategies independently, and talked about how some companies are actually developing tactics to execute those strategies. But let's take kind of a step back and look at all 5 of these together. And I want to reinforce the fact that, one, these are not mutually exclusive. However, you do need to kind of match your strategy to the size and expertise of your organization. For example, the larger super majors are broadly active in all 5 parts of these strategies. But if you're a smaller player that's maybe focused on just upstream, midstream, or just downstream, the scope and ability to change will be much more restricted. So making sure you're right sizing the strategy to the size of your organization is really critical here. Now, no matter the strategy you pick or the size of your organization, you're going to find yourself really considering new technologies. And what's really important as you do that is recognizing that the work you do and the technology you're developing within one strategy won't happen in a silo. To give a good example of this, we can look at hydrogen. So you might be focused on considering hydrogen as a potential fuel strategy if you have retail operations and want to develop hydrogen fueling infrastructure. But it's also worth recognizing that in the broader context of hydrogen and in the energy transition, we're also considering it as a feedstock to make synthetic fuels, feedstocks for making a variety of chemicals, products. In the utility space, we're investigating hydrogen as a source of power or even long duration energy storage. And finally, as a source of combustion for heat, which ideally we aren't doing, but nonetheless is kind of one of the options on the table for decarbonizing heat. We can look elsewhere. You might think, well, I'm going to develop a CCUS strategy to become a sequestration company where we develop and deploy solutions for others. You're going to need to be aware of who needs those solutions. You'll see in the status quo strategy, oil and gas companies that need CCUS on site to meet their own sustainability goals while also continuing to extract their hydrocarbons from the earth. And of course, in the chemical strategy, might need carbon capture on their facilities to meet their decarbonization goals, and or as a feedstock to supply those processes. They'll likely need a source of carbon in the future. And if they have CO2 on site, that may be a promising one. So to conclude today with a few key takeaways, one, really the time to be thinking about what your organization looks like in a net zero world is now. Maybe you're not executing on that strategy immediately, as many of these goals ultimately look at 2050, but we still need to have a view of what you want to work for toward as you start to make those changes internally and start to explore other areas you might want to be active in. It's again important to consider a few different metrics, things like size, existing skill set and operation on the value chain, or geography when you start looking at investigating and identifying these strategies. And finally, if we were to look broadly across all of the technologies that we see possible that oil and gas companies should be considering, we see hydrogen and carbon capture really both as being ubiquitous in terms of they touch upon a really large number of strategies and are well suited to the existing skill set of oil and gas companies. So with that, we'll now open it up to any questions that you may have in the audience.
Right. Thank you, Chris, for the presentation. And indeed, we'll now be taking some questions from the audience. I saw there were some questions already during the presentation. So please feel free to enter more. And remember, you can enter also into questions at luxresearchinc.com. Let me make a quick selection. Here's an interesting one that I think you didn't touch upon, but I'm sure you have an opinion about, Chris. So this is a pretty overarching story about the strategies that an oil and gas company can have. Now, depending on where you are, and certain oil and gas companies, of course, are global, you may make different choices. So can you say a thing or two about how regional differences would impact your choice of strategy or the individual components of the strategy?
Yeah, I think if we look at different regions, I would say, one, there's always a different regulatory environment you operate in, right? And regulations are really important here as they tend to drive and really catalyze a lot of the pace of change of the energy transition. But those regulations are also usually tied back to unique circumstances in a given region. So for example, we could look at countries like Japan and South Korea, which are historically more aggressively focused on hydrogen. But it's unsurprising to see that because they have a lot less land assets, providing enough electricity from wind and solar in those regions to power the entire country while also reserving land for, you know, the communities and growing food and living and roads and all those sorts of things is really challenging. Whereas you could look at other regions like Australia has the opposite problem, where they have obviously a lot of vast amounts of sunlight, and they have lots of space. So we're seeing kind of that emerge as maybe one area that's supplying energy to the others in the form of different energy carriers. So there's a lot of kind of geographical considerations we need to make, a lot of regulatory impacts that impact that. But for example, if I was in that region, I would be considering, how do we turn renewables, or how essentially do we move renewables from point A to point B effectively over the ocean, which is not the same conversation which you might have in, for example, the United States or Europe. So those are kind of, look at the geography and look at the regulatory landscape in the regions that you focus on.
Right. So basically, you want to be careful that you are strong, that you have a strong geographic presence in a lead market for one of your strategies. And I think that's an interesting segue into another question here about Shell. Because Shell recently announced that they are planning to divest of their retail business, their electricity retail business, which they had carefully built over the past 8 years or so, particularly in Europe. So they were in a lead market because Europe has a free electricity market, so you can operate anywhere. You don't have to be a regulated utility to do that. Shell had been building a presence there. They're now divesting. What does that mean? Are they changing strategy, you think, or is something else happening?
I'm glad this was asked as a question. Certainly that's I think probably the best example of the electrification strategy or utility strategy this year that we've seen. But I think it would be a mistake to call that moving away from the utility strategy. As I mentioned, this is a great example of you don't just have to be a retailer to be involved in this strategy. Shell has, a lot of other, businesses that they continue to operate. Like most, they have a project development business. They continue to invest in startups that are active in the electricity space, both for generation and storage, as well as transmission, distribution, things that are more, I would say, relevant at the retail level. So it's more of a change in tactics. It's hard to make a lot of money in the retail business, rather than a change in strategy, moving away from electricity. They still have a lot of activities in the kind of the broad electricity space, if that is a space we can define. It's just they're no longer pursuing being a retailer of electricities, today at least.
All right. Yeah, thanks. So I think we have probably time for one more question, so I have to be careful and select here. And let me remind you again of questions@luxresearchinc.com if I haven't already. If you look at those technologies, and you showed a couple of examples of how a technology could be relevant to multiple strategies, is there any technology you can think of that would be relevant to all strategies, right? For those out there, those listening to our webinar today, who are not quite ready to make a choice in their strategies, is there one thing they should do anyhow, regardless of the choice they make later on?
Yeah, I think I'll give two answers here. One is hydrogen, and I know I mentioned that earlier as well. But the advantage for hydrogen is not necessarily that it's the obvious or best choice in any one single application. It's that we see it being used potentially in a lot of different areas. So from our perspective, we're very confident we'll be using hydrogen in the future of the energy transition. But in terms of which applications emerge and when, that's a little more difficult to specifically say. But I've already talked about hydrogen. If I were to give one example that wasn't hydrogen, I might say long duration energy storage. And I know I talked about this mostly in the utility strategy, but one interesting thing that we've really noticed from the long duration storage companies that we profile in the interview at Lux is that many of them are now not just talking about deployments on the broader, larger electricity grid, where you have to deal with long interconnection queues. There's all those kind of regulatory barriers we noted. Many are actually thinking about behind the meter projects for industrial customers. We hosted an ideathon a week or two ago And topics like supplying for data centers, for larger industrial customers that just want to generate and consume more power behind the meter. That is one area we've seen a lot of interest in. So from there, we will see long duration storage, in industrial applications as well as the grid. And then fundamentally, we do know we will need it in the future, right? So even if you're deploying a direct air capture project, kind of in a remote area, you want to power that with renewables. And if you want to do that around the clock, you'll need long duration storage as well. So it's one of those technologies that anything to do with electricity over time will also see long duration storage inevitably be a part of that conversation as well.
Right. Yeah, thanks. So we're running out of time. So this concludes our webinar for today. I'm seeing quite a few other questions, so I'm sure we could continue the discussion for another half an hour easily. And thankfully, you'll have an opportunity to continue our discussion. Chris, if you can move us to the final slides, you'll be seeing a couple of upcoming webinars that, of course, are highly recommended to you. Specifically one on Japan sustainability, and you mentioned already, Chris, Japan has a specific case where they probably will need hydrogen because they need to import some sort of energy. So highly recommend you follow up our upcoming webinars. Meanwhile, thank you, Chris, for the presentation. The slides and the recording will be sent to all attendees through email, so monitor that. And after the webinar, you'll be prompted to complete a survey on today's presentation. And of course, we would highly appreciate it if you would provide any feedback, good or bad, we like good one, to help us inform and improve our future webinars. So thanks for now, and have a great day.